Have you ever had to choose between the truth that could shatter your family and a lie that lets them sleep at night? My entire professional life is built on championing the truth. I am a school psychologist. I guide teenagers through the minefields of anxiety and depression, teaching them the vocabulary to name their demons. I am 33 years old, and my greatest failure is my own family. The air in my office is a carefully curated calm, smelling faintly of sanitized surfaces and chamomile tea. My last appointment of the day, a boy of 16 with a panic disorder, sat hunched in the armchair. "They'll just say I'm being dramatic," he mumbled, picking at a loose thread on his jeans. "They'll tell me to pray more, or to just get over it." I offered him a small, practiced smile. It was a script I knew by heart. "What if we frame it differently, Jacob?" I leaned forward, keeping my voice low and steady. "What if you're not telling them there's something wrong with you, but that you're trying to be strong? That finding a therapist is like hiring a coach for your mind. You want to get better at handling stress, right? It's a sign of strength, not weakness." His eyes, shadowed with doubt, flickered with a tiny spark of hope. "It's a language I am fluent in, the careful translation of fear into action." The 7 miles between my office in suburban Miami and my parents' house often feel like crossing a national border. I leave behind a world of clinical terms, of strategies and evidence-based practices, and enter the far more volatile territory of faith, pride, and unspoken rules. The air inside their home is always thick with the scent of mommy's cooking, cilantro, garlic, and simmering adobo, a smell that is both comforting and suffocating. Tonight was a celebration, though of what, exactly, was unclear. With my brother Leo, any prolonged period of stability was cause for a feast. He was seated at the head of the table, vibrant and electric, his presence filling the entire room. "It's more than music, you see," he declared, his hands punctuating the air. "It's a frequency. I've found a new chord progression that literally realigns your soul. The world is so out of tune, Ella. I'm going to fix it." My parents were glowing. Poppy, a man whose hands were permanently calloused from 40 years in construction, beamed with a pride that softened his face. Mommy watched Leo with a kind of reverent adoration, as if he were a visiting angel. "Did you hear that, Elena? Your brother, he is a genius," Poppy said, his voice booming. "He has a gift from God. This album he will make, it will change everything for us." I nodded and forced a bite of arepa, the cornmeal suddenly dry as dust in my mouth. I saw it. I saw it all with the terrible clarity of a diagnosis. It wasn't genius, it was mania. The pressured speech, the flight of ideas jumping from chord progressions to cosmic frequencies, the grandiose belief that his music would heal the world. His pupils were dilated, and a feverish, almost painful brightness shone in his eyes. After dinner, he grabbed his guitar. His fingers didn't just play, they attacked the strings, a frantic, brilliant cascade of notes. The music was beautiful, but it was too fast, too dense, like a forest with no space between the trees. He wasn't channeling inspiration, he was being consumed by it. I watched my 28-year-old brother, a man-child burning with an impossible fire, and felt a profound, chilling loneliness. "Isn't he wonderful?" Mommy whispered, her hand finding mine. Her skin was warm, her grip soft. I looked at her hopeful, loving face, then at my father's proud one, and back to my brother, who was now sweating, lost in a frenetic melody. They saw a star on the verge of rising, a gift from God finally revealing its purpose. They were deaf to the discord that I could hear so clearly. I am a professional trained to interpret the silences, to hear the truth behind the words. But in my own home, I was the only one listening, and the truth I heard was the sound of a beautiful, intricate machine beginning to break apart. They saw a miracle. I saw a ticking clock. And I had no idea how to tell them that the beautiful sound they heard was actually the prelude to an explosion. The piercing shrill of a phone at 3 in the morning is a sound that bypasses the ears and goes straight for the heart. It's never good news. It's the sound of car crashes, of emergency rooms, of the absolute worst moments of your life beginning. I snatched it from the nightstand before the second ring, my mind already racing. It was my father. His voice was a ragged edge of panic, stripped of its usual booming confidence. "Elena, you must come. It's Leo. Something is very, very wrong." I was already out of bed, pulling on jeans, the phone pressed hard against my ear. Mommy and I, we heard a crash. His room, Mija, it's destroyed. He was screaming things, that people were listening, that they put wires in his guitar. He said they were hunting him. Poppy's words were tumbling over each other, a frantic rush to make sense of the senseless. "Where is he now, Poppy?" I asked, my own voice a strange, calm instrument in the storm of his fear. My professional brain was already kicking in, a defense mechanism against the terror I felt as a sister. Paranoid delusions, psychotic break. The clinical terms offered a flimsy shield against the images flooding my mind. "He's gone," Poppy choked out. "He just walked out. He said he had to run before they found him. Mommy thinks it's his friends, that new bass player. Bad influences, or maybe stress from the music." Stress, bad influences. They were clinging to rational explanations for a profoundly irrational event. It wasn't a choice. It was a survival instinct. To name the monster would be to admit it was real, that it had been living in their house all along, masquerading as genius. I was in my car in under 5 minutes, the quiet, tree-lined streets of the suburbs feeling sinister and alien in the pre-dawn darkness. My parents' house was a beacon of chaos in the sleeping neighborhood. The front door was wide open, spilling light onto the manicured lawn. Poppy was pacing the driveway, his hands clenching and unclenching. Mommy was in the living room, clutching her rosary, her lips moving in a silent, frantic prayer. She didn't look at me when I came in. Her eyes were fixed on the crucifix on the wall, as if she could compel a miracle through sheer force of will. Leo's room was a war zone. It was a physical manifestation of the violent storm inside his head. His beautiful acoustic guitar, the one Poppy had saved for a year to buy him, was shattered. Its strings curled like dead snakes. Sheets of music were torn to confetti, scattered across a landscape of overturned furniture and shattered picture frames. This wasn't anger. This was a desperate, terrified attempt to claw his way out of his own mind. "We have to find him," I said, turning away from the wreckage. My voice was firm, cutting through their fog of fear and prayer. "We'll take my car. Poppy, you search the neighborhood south of here. Mommy and I will go north, toward the park." For a moment they just stared at me, paralyzed. Then Poppy nodded, a flicker of his old authority returning. Having a task, any task, was a relief from the helplessness. We drove for what felt like an eternity, crawling through the empty streets, my headlights slicing through the darkness. Every shadow looked like a person. Every rustle of palm fronds sounded like footsteps. "Leo!" I called his name into the humid night air, and the sound was swallowed by the silence. What does a psychologist do when the textbook case is her own brother? My mind cycled through risk assessments. He was vulnerable, disoriented, paranoid. He was a danger to himself. We found him on a bench in the old park by the elementary school, the one place we used to go to escape Mommy's watchful eyes as kids. The manic energy was gone. The fire was out. He was just empty. He sat hunched over, staring at his hands, completely still. He was wearing a t-shirt and no shoes, his feet pale against the dark grass. He didn't seem to notice the car pull up or hear us get out. "Leo?" Mommy whispered, her voice trembling as she approached him, as if he were a wounded animal that might bolt. He didn't respond. I walked closer and knelt in front of him. His eyes were vacant, looking straight through me. The feverish brightness was gone, replaced by a dull, profound exhaustion. He was a hollowed-out version of the man who had burned so brightly just 1 week ago. He was here, but he was gone. We had found him, but the person we were looking for was already lost. How do you move a body that has no will? Getting Leo from the park bench into my car was like transporting a life-size doll, his limbs pliant, but his weight a dead, uncooperative burden. Poppy and I half-carried, half-dragged him while Mommy followed behind, her prayers now audible whispers against the encroaching dawn. He didn't resist. He didn't do anything at all. He was simply cargo. The whole way to Miami General, he sat buckled in the back seat, staring out the window at a world he was no longer a part of. The argument started before we even reached the automatic doors of the emergency room. "A hospital, Elena? For what? People will see us. What will we say?" Poppy's voice was a low growl, his fear manifesting as anger. "We say he's not well," I countered, my tone clipped and final. "We say he collapsed from exhaustion. It's the truth, just not all of it." That was the first negotiation in a war of semantics that would come to define our lives. The truth, but not all of it. Inside, the ER was a fluorescent-lit circle of hell, smelling of bleach and quiet desperation. We were an island of tense, ethnic silence amidst the controlled chaos. Leo was docile, allowing a nurse to take his vitals without a word. My parents hovered by the door of the cubicle, as if proximity to the medical equipment might infect them. I answered the questions, giving the nurse a carefully edited version of the night's events. A severe panic attack, confusion, exhaustion. I left out the paranoid delusions. I wasn't ready to fight that battle yet. A doctor with tired, intelligent eyes came in and shone a light in Leo's pupils. She asked him what year it was. He didn't answer. She pressed a finger into his sternum, a test for responsiveness. He barely flinched. After a brief exam, she drew me aside, past the curtain. "His vitals are all over the place. Tachycardia, elevated blood pressure. We're giving him a mild sedative to calm his system. But this isn't just exhaustion, you know that." I nodded, my throat tight. "He's had a significant psychotic episode." Hearing the words spoken by another professional was both a relief and a terror. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. But the confirmation also made it terrifyingly real. The doctor continued, her voice low. "Once he's stabilized, I strongly recommend an immediate consultation with the on-call psychiatrist. We need to know what we're dealing with." I saw my parents stiffen just outside the curtain. They had heard the word. The word was a lit match in a room full of gasoline. "No," Poppy said, stepping forward. His voice was dangerously quiet. "No psychiatrist. Our son is not crazy." The doctor's calm professional demeanor didn't waver. "Sir, this has nothing to do with being crazy. It's about brain chemistry, about finding the right treatment to prevent this from happening again. It's a medical issue." But he wasn't listening. He was hearing the judgment of our community, the whispers, the shame. An hour later, the sedative had worked its magic. Leo was asleep, his face relaxed for the first time in weeks. The manic energy was gone. When he woke up, he was quiet and lucid, though profoundly weak. "What happened?" he murmured, looking at the IV in his arm. Mommy rushed to his side, stroking his hair, tears streaming down her face. "It's okay, mi amor. You were just tired. Too much work." This was the opening they needed. The proof. He was back. Their Leo was back. Against the doctor's explicit advice, against my frantic, whispered pleas, my parents checked him out of the hospital. "He just needs to rest," Mommy insisted, her jaw set with the stubborn force of a mother's denial. "He needs my sancocho. He needs to be home, in his own bed. Not in a place like this, with those doctors." She couldn't even say the word. They signed the paperwork, absolving the hospital of all responsibility. They had their son back, and they were pulling him back into the comforting darkness of their own reality. We walked out of the ER and into the bright morning sun, a family retreating from a war they refused to admit had even begun. Have you ever tried to explain the concept of color to someone born blind? That was me. For 3 days, living in my parents' house. A fragile, suffocating peace had settled over us after the flight from the hospital. Leo slept. He slept for 16 hours a time, a deep, drugged-looking slumber that was the polar opposite of his manic energy. To my parents, this was healing. To me, it was the other face of the same monster. The depressive crash after the psychotic peak. Mommy moved through the house on tiptoe, constantly simmering broths and preparing his favorite meals for the brief moments he was awake. She was treating a fever. Poppy went back to work, his shoulders a little less stooped, convinced the episode had passed. They were building a fortress of normalcy, brick by hopeful brick. And they expected me to live inside it with them. But I couldn't. The truth was a living thing inside me, and it was demanding to be spoken. On the 4th night, I waited until Leo had shuffled back to his room after eating a few bites of dinner in silence. I found Mommy and Poppy in the kitchen, washing dishes together in a comfortable, practiced rhythm. This was it. "Mommy, Poppy, we need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Not about what happened, but about why it happened, and how we stop it from happening again." They exchanged a look, a silent, weary communication. They knew this was coming. We sat at the kitchen table, the polished wood reflecting the dim light. I started slowly, trying to use the tools of my trade. "Imagine Leo has diabetes," I began. "His body doesn't produce insulin correctly. It's not his fault. It's not a weakness of his character. It's a chemical issue. You would give him insulin, right? You would take him to a doctor to manage it." Poppy nodded slowly, his expression wary. "Of course," he said. "What's happening with Leo is similar," I continued, leaning forward, trying to will them to understand. "His brain's chemistry isn't working correctly. It's an illness, just like diabetes. It's called bipolar disorder. The mania, the energy, the genius. That's one side. The crash, the exhaustion, the paranoia. That's the other. It's a chemical imbalance. It can be treated. With medicine. With therapy." The words felt heavy and dangerous as they left my mouth. Silence. Then Poppy pushed his chair back, the sound scraping loudly in the quiet room. "No." It was a single word, but it was a slammed door, a locked gate. "Elena, you have spent too long in those American schools. You have a name for everything, a pill for every sadness. In our family, there are no crazy people." His voice rose, filled with an anger born of deep, primal fear. "Your brother is not sick. He is sensitive. He is an artist. He was under stress." I turned to my mother, my last hope. She was tracing the pattern of the tablecloth with her finger, avoiding my eyes. "Mommy, you saw him. You saw what happened. This is not stress." She finally looked up, her eyes full of a pain that tore at me, but her voice was resolute. "We will pray, mija. We have not been praying enough. The church has a prayer group. We will go. Faith is the best medicine. God will heal him." It was a wall, a solid, unbreachable wall built of pride and prayer. My education, my profession, my carefully constructed arguments. They all crumbled into dust against it. They didn't see a diagnosis that could lead to a solution. They saw a brand, a stigma, a label of shame I was trying to pin on their son, on our family. I wasn't their daughter trying to help. In that moment, I was the enemy, the one speaking an ugly, foreign truth they were determined to deny. Do you know what's worse than a crisis? A routine made of crises. The weeks following our retreat from the hospital bled into one another, each day marked by a new disaster. My phone was no longer a tool for connection, it was a fire alarm, and my family had appointed me the sole firefighter. I became their crisis manager, their negotiator, their human tranquilizer. They were desperate for the symptoms of my professional skill, but they violently rejected its source. It started with his job at the small music shop. Poppy called me, his voice tight with a familiar mix of shame and command. Elena, Leo did not go to work for 2 days. Mr. Henderson called. He is a good man, but he has a business to run. You must call him. You know how to speak to these people. Explain it. Explain what? That my brother was in the grip of a crippling depression, barely able to get out of bed? No. The family narrative was simpler. Just tell him Leo is having some personal problems, that he is a genius and sometimes distracted. I made the call. I used my calm, professional voice, the one I used on anxious parents and defiant teenagers. I spoke of a difficult family situation and temporary stress. I was a damn good liar. Mr. Henderson was sympathetic, but he fired Leo the following Monday. My parents' reaction wasn't concern for Leo's state, but anger at the injustice. He has no loyalty, Poppy declared. He doesn't appreciate true talent. They saw a callous boss, not a consequence of an untreated illness. Then came the calls from Sophia, his girlfriend. She was a sweet girl, a singer who had adored Leo's supposed genius. Now her texts were frantic. He was accusing her of working for the government, of putting listening devices in his speakers. He would be volatile and aggressive 1 minute, then weepy and apologetic the next. I don't know who I'm talking to anymore, Ella. It scares me. Mommy's advice was simple and devastating. She must be more patient. A woman's job is to soothe a man's soul. So I became the intermediary, another perversion of my skills. I translated Leo's paranoid delusions into artistic anxieties for Sophia. I translated Sophia's legitimate fear into girlish drama for my parents. I was a professional communicator, trapped in a family where no one was truly listening, using my words not to build bridges to the truth, but to wallpaper over the cracks in their wall of denial. Every conversation felt like a betrayal of my brother and of myself. And then, inevitably, came the money. Mommy called, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. Mijo's rent is due, Elena. He spent his money on new equipment. For the album. You know how he is. Could you just lend him a little? Just until he gets back on his feet. I knew the money wasn't for equipment. I knew it was gone. But I wrote the check. Because saying no would mean starting a war, and for now, I was still just a firefighter. I was extinguishing the small daily blazes, all while knowing the entire forest was about to go up in flames. What is the exact price of a family's hope? For my parents, it was $2,700, tucked away in an old Café Bustelo coffee can in the back of their closet. This wasn't investment money, it was emergency money. It was the tangible result of Poppy's overtime, of Mommy's careful grocery budgeting, of decades of sacrifice distilled into a roll of worn bills. It was the money for a broken transmission, a sudden plane ticket to Colombia, a funeral. It was their armor against the unpredictable cruelty of life. The shift in Leo was subtle at first, a slow tide turning. The profound, heavy silence of his depressive state began to recede. It was replaced by a familiar, dangerous hum. The leg jiggling started again. Then came the frantic, late-night calls, not of paranoia, but of revelation. He wasn't sleeping. He was writing, composing, tapping into that same cosmic frequency he'd talked about weeks ago. My parents saw it as a recovery. They praised God. I felt a cold dread in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't a sunrise. It was the glare of an oncoming train. The call from Mommy came on a Thursday afternoon. Her voice wasn't panicked or angry. It was something far worse. Hollow. There were no tears, just a flat, dead tone that terrified me more than any scream. "It's gone, Elena," she said. "The can. It's empty. Poppy went to put a little extra in, and it's all gone." I didn't have to ask. I knew. There was only one possible answer, one force in our lives chaotic enough to breach that sacred trust. I just said, "I'm on my way." The house was suffocatingly quiet when I arrived. Poppy was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the empty red and yellow coffee can as if it were a casket. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. Mommy was on the sofa, her rosary beads still, her face a mask of exhausted disbelief. This wasn't the aftermath of a psychotic break. This was the aftermath of a profound betrayal, a theft not just of money, but of a lifetime of carefully built security. Then Leo emerged from his room. He wasn't apologetic or ashamed. He was radiant, incandescent with joy. And in his hands was the most beautiful guitar I had ever seen, a vintage Gibson with a deep sunburst finish that seemed to glow. "Look," he said, his voice ringing with triumph. "Isn't she perfect? I found her online. It was a sign. This is the one. The sound from this guitar. It's going to open doors. This is the key, Ella. This is the key to everything." He was utterly oblivious, lost in the grand illusion that he had just secured their future. Poppy finally looked up from the empty can, his gaze landing on his son. His voice was gravelly, broken. "You are an egoist," he said, the words heavy with a lifetime of disappointment. "You are ungrateful." Mommy began to weep, deep, silent sobs. "Our money," she whispered. "The money for our old age. How could you do this to us? After everything we have sacrificed for you." And in that moment, watching them, I finally understood. I saw the terrible, twisted logic of their denial. To admit Leo was sick would be to absolve him of this act. But they couldn't. Their love and their pride were so intertwined, they couldn't separate the illness from the man. To protect their own worldview, where sons are grateful and God is in control, they had to make him a villain. Their denial wasn't just a shield anymore. It had become a weapon they were now aiming at their own child. It was distorting their love into resentment. I looked at my father, a man broken by his son's supposed selfishness. I looked at my mother, weeping for the betrayal of the boy she adored. And I looked at my brother, clutching a piece of wood and wire that he believed was his salvation. I had been trying to fix the problems, to smooth things over, to keep the peace. But I realized I wasn't preventing a disaster. I was just enabling a slow, agonizing demolition of my own family. The firefighting was over. It was time to let it burn. Have you ever been the only person in a room who can see the fire everyone else calls warmth? The days after the Gibson guitar incident were a void. The shouting had stopped, replaced by a silence that was far more terrifying. My parents didn't call me to extinguish fires anymore. They didn't call me at all. In their eyes, I was the one who had brought the ugly language of diagnosis and blame into their home. The real problem wasn't Leo's illness. It was my refusal to participate in the fiction that he was simply an ungrateful artist. Loneliness is a physical thing. It's a weight in your chest, a cold space in your bed. I would come home from a day of helping other people's children find the words for their pain and sit in a silence so profound I could hear my own blood pulsing in my ears. In the endless, scrolling darkness of one sleepless night, I found myself typing words into a search bar that felt like a confession of my own failure. Family denies mental illness, how to help someone with bipolar who refuses treatment, cultural shame, and psychosis. Link after link led to sterile medical articles or generic blog posts. And then I saw it. An acronym. NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. There was a link to local support groups. One was meeting the next evening, less than 5 miles from my apartment, in the basement of a Presbyterian church. A professional psychologist seeking help in a church basement. The irony was bitter. My pride screamed at me to close the laptop. My desperation was stronger. The next night, I almost turned my car around 3 different times. The room was exactly what you'd expect. Fluorescent lights, a circle of mismatched chairs, the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. About a dozen people were there, a mix of ages and ethnicities. I took a seat in the back, feeling like an imposter, a spy. I was there to observe, to gather data. I was not one of them. That was the lie I told myself. Then they started to talk. A woman with beautifully manicured nails spoke about her daughter, whose shopping sprees and grandiose plans had led to bankruptcy. My husband just keeps giving her money. He says she has an energetic personality. He doesn't see the crash that comes after. An older Black woman spoke of her son, a veteran. He says the VA doctors are poisoning him, the family. They tell me to just pray. Put it in God's hands, they say. But God isn't the one who is going to find him dead in his apartment. With every story, a layer of my professional detachment was stripped away. My clinical isolation evaporated. These were my parents' words, my family's fears, spoken by strangers. This wasn't my private, unique shame. It was a shared, brutal landscape. When it was my turn to speak, my voice was a stranger's, thin and shaky. I told them everything: the mania, the crash, the denial, the stolen money, the Gibson guitar. When I finished, an older man sitting across from me, a man with kind eyes and hands that looked like they'd fixed 1,000 broken things, nodded slowly. "Thank you for sharing that," he said, his voice calm and steady. "We've all been the firefighter. We've all paid the rent and smoothed things over with the landlord. We think we're helping. We think it's love." He paused, and his gaze met mine. "But sometimes, to save a person, you have to be willing to go against the will of those who love them. Sometimes you have to love someone enough to let them face the consequences of their own storm. Some people call it tough love. I call it the last resort." What's the difference between a life raft and an anchor? They both stop you from drifting away. I drove back from that NAMI meeting with the old man's words echoing in my head. The last resort. I realized that for weeks, I hadn't been a life raft for my family. I had been their anchor, holding them fast in a sea of denial, allowing them to believe they could weather this storm without ever learning how to sail. To save them, I had to cut the rope. I didn't call first. I showed up at their door on a Saturday afternoon, a time I knew they'd both be home. I walked in with a strange, cold calm that I didn't recognize in myself. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my hands were steady. I was a surgeon about to perform a painful, necessary amputation on her own body. Mommy was in the kitchen, humming a sad, familiar folk song while folding laundry. Poppy was watching a soccer game, the volume turned low. The house was saturated with a tense, fragile peace. "We need to talk," I said, and the humming stopped. Poppy muted the television. They looked at me, and they must have seen the change, because the wary, defensive look they'd worn for weeks hardened on their faces. We didn't go to the kitchen table. We stood in the living room, a triangle of unresolved pain. "I came here to tell you what I am going to do," I said, my voice even, "and what I am no longer going to do." I took a breath. "From this moment on, I will not be your crisis manager. I will not give Leo another cent. I will not call his landlord, his job, or his friends. I will not lie for him or for you. I am done putting out the fires." The words landed in the quiet room like stones. Mommy's hand flew to her mouth. Poppy's face darkened, a thundercloud of wounded pride. "I am stepping away completely," I continued, my voice unwavering. "I am removing myself as your safety net." "This is what your books teach you?" Poppy's voice was a low growl. "To abandon your family? To turn your back on your own blood because things get difficult? We did not raise you to be so cruel, Elena." Mommy started to cry, the tears she always used as a shield and a weapon. "How can you do this to him? He is your brother. He is suffering. He needs us. He needs you. This is not love." "No," I said, and the word was sharper than I intended. "This is love. The last resort. Continuing this way, pretending he's just sensitive, letting him destroy himself and this family while you pray for a miracle. That is not love. That is fear. And I will not participate in it anymore." I looked at both of them, my parents, whom I loved more than anything. "There is one thing I will do. If you decide you are ready to get him real, medical help, I will find the best doctor in this state. I will drive him to every appointment. I will sit with you in family therapy. I will help you heal. But that is the only help I will offer. The choice is yours. You can accept professional help, or you can handle this storm, the three of you, on your own." I turned and walked out the door before my resolve could shatter, leaving them in the ruins of the world I had just destroyed. What is the sound of a gamble paying off? I thought it would be a phone call, a surrender, a quiet admission of defeat. Instead, it was silence. A dense, deliberate silence that lasted for 7 days. Each day was 100 years long. They didn't call me. Not to scream, not to bargain, not to blame. In their world, I no longer existed. I had committed the ultimate sin. I had named the monster in the house, and in doing so, I had become the monster myself. I went to work. I sat with teenagers and guided them through their own darkness, my voice a calm, reassuring instrument that felt like a lie. How could I counsel a child on communicating with their parents when I had just detonated my own family? Every time my phone buzzed, my heart seized, a painful jolt of adrenaline and hope. But it was always a work email, a text from a friend, a news alert. It was never them. The silence wasn't an absence of noise, it was a presence. It was the sound of my brother, untethered, drifting in a storm without his anchor. I knew the manic energy of the guitar purchase couldn't last. Mania always demands payment. It's a physiological law, as certain as gravity. I imagined him in his room, the beautiful Gibson standing silent in the corner, a monument to a fleeting godhood. The cosmic frequencies would have faded, replaced by the crushing weight of reality. The money was gone. His girlfriend was gone. His job was gone. And now, the one person who had always stepped in to fix things was also gone. My tough love had been a calculated risk, a psychologist's desperate gambit. But what if my calculation was wrong? The call came on a Sunday night just after 10. The name on the screen was Poppy. The silence was over. I answered, my hand shaking. But the voice on the other end wasn't the angry, proud man who had accused me of cruelty. It wasn't the panicked man who had called me from a wrecked bedroom. This was the voice of a ghost. It was a hollow whisper, devoid of life. "Elena," he said, and the single word was a universe of sorrow. He took your mother's pills. All of them. The ambulance is here. The world didn't stop. That's the cruelest part. On the drive to the hospital, the streetlights were still green. The radio was still playing a stupid pop song. People were laughing on the sidewalks. My world had imploded, but the rest of the universe hadn't noticed. My professional mind was a useless, chattering thing, throwing out clinical terms: overdose, respiratory depression, anoxic brain injury, while the part of me that was a sister was just screaming. I had done this. My ultimatum. My cold, calculated withdrawal of support. I hadn't just let him face the storm. I had pushed his boat out into the hurricane. They were in the waiting room, not speaking, not touching. They were just two separate islands of grief. Poppy looked like a collapsed building, all his structural integrity gone. He was gray. His shoulders, which had carried the weight of our family for 40 years, were slumped in utter defeat. Mommy was staring at the wall, her hands limp in her lap, her rosary beads forgotten. There were no tears. She was beyond tears. When they saw me, there was no accusation in their eyes. There was nothing. The wall of denial hadn't just been breached, it had been annihilated by the truth, and the truth had arrived in the form of an ambulance. A doctor finally came out. She had that practiced, gentle look of someone who delivers bad news for a living. "We got to him in time," she said, and I felt my knees almost buckle with a relief so profound it was painful. "We pumped his stomach, and he's breathing on his own, but he's unconscious. He's stable, for now." She looked at all of us, at our shattered faces. "He's very lucky." Lucky. I looked through the small window in the ICU door and saw my brother, pale and still beneath a white blanket, a tube in his nose. The terrible, undeniable proof that I had been right all along was lying in that bed, and it looked nothing like a victory. Have you ever wondered what happens after the worst has been prevented? There is no victory parade. There is only the quiet, antiseptic hum of the machines that are doing the work your love could not. For 24 hours, we existed in that limbo. Leo was moved from the ICU to a regular room. He was conscious, but it was a flat, vacant consciousness. He looked at us, but I don't think he saw us. He saw the geography of his own private hell. My parents and I had a silent, unspoken truce. We sat in the uncomfortable vinyl chairs, drank bitter coffee from styrofoam cups, and watched him. The war was over because the battlefield had been obliterated. There was nothing left to fight about. The undeniable fact of what Leo had tried to do was a fourth person in the room, a silent, hulking presence that took up all the air. They were no longer parents trying to protect a sensitive son. They were just two old, tired people staring at the wreckage. Late in the afternoon, a woman came into the room. She wasn't a nurse. She wore a tailored blazer and carried a tablet. She introduced herself as Dr. Anya Sharma, a psychiatrist with the hospital. The name hung in the air, the word they had feared more than any other. She had a calm, unreadable face and a gentle but firm voice. She asked my parents a few questions about Leo's history, which they answered in clipped, monosyllabic sentences. Then she turned her attention to the three of us. "I've reviewed Leo's case, and I've spoken with the ER physician," she began, her tone leaving no room for argument. "He made a credible and very nearly successful attempt on his life. As a result, he presents a clear and immediate danger to himself." Poppy started to open his mouth, to offer one of the old excuses: stress, art, sensitivity. But Dr. Sharma held up a hand. "This is no longer a matter of opinion or family discretion. Under Florida state law," she continued, and every word was a nail being hammered into the coffin of their denial. Specifically the Baker Act, when a person is deemed a danger to themselves or others, we are legally mandated to place them under an involuntary psychiatric hold for up to 72 hours. She let the words sink in. Leo will be transferred to the psychiatric ward for observation and evaluation. You cannot take him home. This is not a request. It is the law. The law. It was an opponent my father couldn't intimidate. It was a power my mother's prayers could not sway. For the first time, they were confronted by an authority greater than their own pride. Papi just stared at her, his face slack. All the fight, all the righteous anger had drained out of him, leaving behind the shell of a defeated man. Mommy looked at me, and for the first time in a month, her eyes were not angry or pleading, but terrified and lost. She was a woman whose entire belief system had just been declared legally irrelevant. Their denial had finally crashed against a wall that would not yield, and it had shattered into dust. Do you know the difference between a hospital and a psychiatric ward? In a hospital, the doors swoosh open. In a psych ward, they buzz and click, and they are always locked. It's the sound of a line being crossed, from a place where you are trying to save a life to a place where you are trying to contain one. I walked down the sterile, silent corridor, my footsteps echoing unnaturally. My parents were sitting on a hard plastic bench, side by side, but not touching. They weren't devastated anymore. They were just gone. I sat down in the chair opposite them. The air between us wasn't charged with anger or betrayal. It was a vacuum, empty of everything. Papi, a man whose physical presence had always dominated any room he was in, seemed to have shrunk. He was staring at his own hands, calloused and strong, as if they belonged to someone else. Mommy's gaze was fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor. Her rosary was gone. Her faith, her anger, her denial. All her weapons had been taken from her at the door. She was the one who broke the silence. She didn't look at me, but her voice, a threadbare whisper, was aimed directly at my heart. "Elena," she said, her throat raspy, "is this our fault?" It was the question I had been waiting for, the one I had been dreading, the question that meant everything had changed. It was not an accusation. It was a genuine plea for an answer she no longer had. It was the first word of surrender. The daughter in me wanted to rush over, to hold her and say, "No, Mommy, of course not, it's not your fault." The daughter in me wanted to lie, to provide the easy comfort. But she wasn't talking to her daughter anymore. She was talking to the only expert she knew. I took a breath and spoke to her as a professional, my voice quiet but clear. "If Leo's heart had a faulty valve that caused a heart attack, would it be your fault?" Papi looked up, his eyes dull with confusion. "What?" "No. That is a sickness of the body." "Exactly," I said, leaning forward. "The brain is a part of the body. It's an organ, like the heart or the kidneys. It runs on electricity and chemicals. Sometimes the wiring is different. Sometimes the chemical balance is wrong. It's not a weakness of spirit. It's not a punishment from God. It's genetics. It's biology." I looked at my father. "It's in his blueprint, Papi, the same way your strong hands are in his blueprint. It just is." They were listening. For the first time, they were truly listening. The doctors have a name for it: bipolar disorder. It means his brain can't regulate its own chemistry. It creates storms. Sometimes the storm is mania, that feeling of being a genius who can conquer the world. And sometimes, my voice faltered for a second, sometimes the storm is a depression so deep and so dark, you would do anything to make it stop. I let the truth of it sit in the air between us. "So no," I said, my voice softening. "It is not your fault. You cannot be at fault for the color of his eyes, and you cannot be at fault for the chemistry of his brain." I saw a flicker of relief in Mommy's eyes, a loosening in Papi's shoulders. But I wasn't finished. I had to take away the guilt, but I had to give them something else in its place. Fault is about the past. It's useless. But responsibility is about the future. And what we do next is our shared responsibility. The dialogue had finally begun, there in that cold, quiet hallway, and it was the first painful step toward home. What is the first day of the rest of your life supposed to feel like? It doesn't feel like a sunrise. It feels like waking up in the wreckage of an earthquake. The ground is stable, but nothing is where it used to be. The official diagnosis, bipolar I disorder, was delivered by Dr. Sharma on a Tuesday. It was a name for the ghost that had haunted our family for years. A name is a powerful thing. It can be a label, a cage, or a key. We didn't know which one it would be yet. Leo knew. To him, it was a cage. He wasn't the manic prophet or the hollowed-out shell anymore. He was just my brother, sitting sullenly in a chair in the ward's common room, his face a mask of angry betrayal. The doctors had started him on a mood stabilizer, a small white pill that he looked at as if it were poison. "So that's it?" he said to me, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "My entire life, everything I've felt, all the music, it's all just a symptom you can drug away? You want to make me normal. You want to make me boring." I didn't argue. I couldn't. Because a small, terrible part of him was right. We were trying to take away the fire, not understanding that he saw the fire as the most essential part of himself. His genius had been reclassified as an illness. His magic had been given a clinical name. Dr. Sharma worked with him, her patience a calm, steady force against his rage. I sat with him, not as a psychologist, but as his sister, talking about the weather, about a stupid movie I'd seen, about anything other than the storm that had brought us here. The first session of family therapy was 1 week later. The room was on the 3rd floor of the hospital's outpatient clinic. It was a small, neutral space with soft chairs and a box of tissues on the table that felt like a loaded gun. Poppy sat stiffly, his back not touching the chair, as if he were a visitor in a foreign embassy. Mommy clutched her purse on her lap, a substitute for the rosary she had left at home. Leo slouched, his arms crossed, a silent wall of defiance. They were all there. That was the only victory for now. The therapist, a kind-looking man named Dr. Evans, didn't push. He simply created a space for silence. "I know this is new for all of you," he said, his voice gentle. "There's no script here. Why don't we start with how everyone is feeling right now, in this room?" The silence that followed was a physical presence. It was the sound of years of unspoken truths, of secrets and shame. I watched my father, a man I had only ever seen as a pillar of strength, look utterly and completely lost. Then Poppy cleared his throat. He looked at Dr. Evans, not at us. "I am," he began, his voice rough. "I am afraid." It was perhaps the most honest sentence I had ever heard him speak. Mommy looked at him, and her own eyes filled with tears. "Me too," she whispered. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a breakthrough in the cinematic sense, but it was a start. It was the first 2 words of a new language we would all have to learn together. We were a family of 4, sitting in a stranger's office, finally beginning to talk, finally beginning to heal. How do you measure healing? It isn't a single dramatic moment. It's a collection of quiet, unremarkable ones. It's the sound of a fork scraping against a plate during a comfortable silence. It's the easy rhythm of a conversation that doesn't feel like a negotiation. 1 year after the world ended, I sat at my parents' dinner table, and for the first time in a decade, I wasn't listening for the prelude to an explosion. I was just listening. Leo sat across from me, telling a story about a 9-year-old student who was convinced he could play a Beethoven sonata with his elbows. He wasn't a rock star destined to heal the world with a new frequency. He was a music teacher. He took his medication every morning. He saw his therapist every Thursday. On weekends, he played guitar in a small jazz trio at a dimly lit bar downtown. He wasn't famous. He was stable. And the quiet contentment on his face was more beautiful than any manic genius had ever been. "Maria from the NAMI meeting called me today," Mommy said, as she passed the platter of rice. "Her son just got his diagnosis. The family, they are ashamed. They want to hide it." She shook her head, not with judgment, but with a deep, weary empathy. I told her, "The shame is a poison. It's harder to fight than the illness." Poppy nodded, adding, "I told her husband, the priest is for the soul. The doctor is for the brain. You need both." They had become ambassadors to a country they never wanted to visit. My father turned to Leo, his voice devoid of the old, booming pride, replaced by a quiet, genuine interest. "How was your session this week, mijo?" Leo didn't flinch. He didn't get defensive. He just took a sip of water. "It was good, Poppy. We talked about finding a new baseline, about what happy looks like without the mania." It was a conversation spoken in a language we had all learned together, a dialect of honesty built from the rubble of our denial. And then, Leo laughed. It started with a small smile at something Poppy said, and it grew into a full, genuine laugh. It wasn't the frantic, feverish sound of his mania, the sound that always felt like a prelude to a scream. This was a calm, warm sound that filled the small kitchen. It was the sound of a man at peace in his own mind. It was the sound of a Sunday dinner. It was the sound of a miracle, not the kind Mommy used to pray for, but a quiet, ordinary one, paid for in tears and truth. I watched them, my family, rebuilt from the ground up on a foundation of difficult honesty. I remembered the terror of my ultimatum, the gut-wrenching guilt after Leo's attempt, the cold, hard face of the law in that hospital corridor. I had been so sure I was destroying them. The firefighter who had finally decided the only way to save the forest was to burn a path right through the middle of it. The memory still felt like a scar. But sitting here, in the easy warmth of this new reality, I understood. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is to refuse to participate in a beautiful, destructive lie. Sometimes, to save your family, you have to be willing to break their hearts, and your own. You have to love them enough to orchestrate the crisis that will finally force them to see. It's the cruelest kind of love there is, and it was the only thing that could have saved us.